Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Visconti, and with great pleasure, we're going to have Dr. David Petrove speak in a couple of moments, and the topic is staying motivated during difficult times. Just a couple of thoughts about Phase 2 careers. If you're new to Phase 2 careers, we're here to serve you. We're for the over 40 professional. We do job search, career development, and small business workshops, seminars. So we do anything in the course of job search or career development. So pay attention to some of our upcoming programs. We're here to serve you. Specifically, what we have coming up on Thursday, we have the Employment Hour with Slingshot Connections. Teresa Chotman is going to talk about openings with their staffing firm and how to work with them. Next week, we have a full schedule. You could change your brain with Randy Block. Has some information about research and ways to increase brain growth. And next Tuesday, we're going to have Raylene Nisbet, who's with West Valley Staffing, is going to talk about how to work with recruiters. And finally, on Friday, we're going to have a topic is career transition and also using success teams. So please stay tuned to a lot of Phase 2 upcoming events. Just some points of reference. Every program is slightly different. This is different from Zoom. It's GoToWebinar. And in this case, rather than the chat feature, you're going to use the question feature. And if for whatever reason you drop off the webinar, just go back to the original link. And so that's a little, shows you where the icon is for the question. And also, sometimes we will have handouts that we give at the very end of the program. I believe Dr. David Petrove is going to make a PDF available if you request it. Now about our presenter. Boy, he's a great speaker. He's given countless talks for Phase 2 and several Bay Area groups. He's a frequently asked presenter. He has lots of specialties, career coaching, transition planning. He's an expert in the Myers-Briggs and a career development facilitator. And he's also a member of a national advisory board on career one-stops. So it's with great pleasure I introduce you to Dr. David Petrove. Hi, David.
Hi, Ron. So welcome, everyone. And just to get us started, I want to let you know that Ron is going to be playing my Vanna White, and he'll be advancing the slides and opening up the polls and directing questions to me. So I really appreciate his help and cooperation with this. Obviously, for many of us, this is uncharted territory as we move into more online presentations. And so today we're going to be talking, as Ron said, about staying motivated during difficult times. And so for myself, this all began back in March, as I'm sure it did for many of you. So the night before, on March 16th, I was in a restaurant that is usually packed with people. Only a few tables were occupied. When I woke up the next morning, I thought life is going to be different. And it certainly was. And one of the things that I found difficult for me was just maintaining some type of focus, because all of a sudden my days were going to look totally different. So what I did was to go onto Facebook and post a question about how are people feeling right now? And sure enough, I found that I wasn't alone. So Ron, if you'll advance to the next slide. Okay, today we're going to be looking at 3 different objectives for our workshop. We're going to be looking at how motivation is affected during challenging times like these, the effects or lack of or decreased motivation at this time, and developing some tools for staying motivated. And we'll check in at the end of the webinar and find out how we did in meeting our objectives. So you can advance, Ron. Okay, this probably looks familiar to many of you. It is the proverbial carrot. that dangles in front of us, and oftentimes we think of it as a donkey, but here it's a human being just like ourselves. And this care is outside of the person. It's what we refer to as extrinsic or external motivation. There's also another type of motivation we'll be discussing today, which is intrinsic or internal. You wouldn't be able to see that because it's actually inside the person. So if you'll advance, Ron. Okay, so it's important to just think about what is motivation. And I thought about this and I see it as really an energizing force. It's about an energy that moves or propels you forward in order to either complete a short-term task or achieve a long-term goal. Go ahead. So, question we're all asking ourselves these days is, why is it so difficult for us to stay motivated? Well, and you've probably heard this phrase many, many times, which is unprecedented times. We have no roadmap as to what the future looks like because we've never dealt with anything at this level before. The closest that I can think of that approximates this would be back in 1918 and 1919. You're probably familiar with the Spanish flu. And that took the lives of between 50 and 100 million people across the planet. That was a health issue. Then in October of 1929, we had the stock market crash. And I looked that up and didn't realize that lasted an entire 10 years. That was about the economy. What we've got today is these two arenas colliding: the health of the coronavirus and the economy with what we're dealing with the jobless rate and everything that goes with that. And we're also dealing with what I call global grief. Not only are we talking about grieving on a personal level, but also on a global level. And prior to all of this with COVID-19, let's face it, life looked pretty predictable. So we generally worked in a job that had a sense of security. We would show up in the morning. We would know that at the end of so many days, we would have the weekend to look forward to. Well, all of that seemed to change without a lot of advance notice. And so what's happening now is we're dealing with loss. Okay, Ron, go ahead. So let's talk about the types of losses that we're grieving right now. I think the first one is a loss of control. And this typically has to do with having a choice. What I do, where I go, when I go. And this is followed by a loss of freedom, where we've only been able to access certain essential services. And that is based upon what someone else has decided for us. Look at your personal space and what's happened there. People are having to do shelter in place now, where they're sharing their space with their families, their roommates, and so they no longer have that same sense of privacy, especially if you have school-age children and they've been home because the schools have been shut down. That also adds to the complications of all of this. Incomes have either been reduced or in many cases are non-existent. And related to this is what we're seeing with jobs right now. As of today, over 40 million claims for unemployment have been made. And they're saying that it's probably higher than that, but people are just having a difficult time filing for this. And it's interesting that we're now at a point with that 40+ million where we're rivaling what occurred during the Great Depression. And at this point, 1 out of 4 American workers is out of work. So it's that loss. The physical contact, okay, with the social distancing, having to be apart from one another at least 6 feet. Think of what that is like for individuals who live alone and what that might look like. And so we have a psychological term called skin hunger. When we're separated from people long enough, we pay a price for that. How about the loss of ability to travel? People have to put their vacations on hold indefinitely. Business trips have been canceled or postponed. And finally, and what we hope that we don't all go through, is the possible death of a family member or friend. And in a case like this, what we're looking at is right now, just in this country alone, there have been 104,000 deaths related to this COVID virus, 360,000 globally. So almost 1 in 3, 3.5 occurs just in this country alone. Okay, Ron. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our little polling booth, and we're going to have you indicate which of these losses you've had. So just click all that apply. And we do have a space for other, and this is done anonymously. So people will not see who is responding, just the numbers. So go ahead and do that. Okay, Ron, are we ready to show our results on this one?
Sure.
Okay, the biggest is a loss of freedom of these 5, and 39% said other. So clearly, freedom, income have been seriously affected, with personal space and control equally divided. Okay, let's take a look at the next 4. Okay, so the job, physical contact, ability to travel, possible death of a family member or friend. Go ahead and mark which of those you've also been experiencing in terms of a loss. Okay, Ron, let's take a look at what the results are here. Okay, look at that, 74%. Probably the highest has to do with the job. So we're looking at job, freedom, income. Many of these are interrelated. So you can see how powerful this situation is in terms of what we're experiencing. So now that we've looked at this, let's take a look at what is going on in terms of grieving per se. Okay, so we've gone through this piece of it. And we'll go to the next. Okay, so typically when people are going through grieving, there are a series of stages that they experience, and probably you're familiar with the model that Elisabeth Kubler-Ross developed, and believe it or not, it's as recent as 1969 that she did this. She came up with 5 different stages that people go through in experiencing a loss, and then a 6th one was recently added that we'll talk about. So the first one is denial. And basically this is a "this isn't happening" situation. In this case, it will show up as statements on a personal level like, "It's only the flu. It will go away in the spring. More people die from car accidents than from COVID-19. I don't understand what the big deal is." Once you've moved through denial, the next stage that she talks about is anger, which is more about how dare this happen. And this would be more about, I'm tired of having to stay home. My basic rights are being infringed upon. I can't do what I want when I want. This is then followed by bargaining, which has to do with an action that we could have taken to keep from what's happening currently from existing. So this would show up as, if we had started to address this earlier, we wouldn't be where we are right now. Or if more people stayed home, we wouldn't be spreading this. So the way that you know that it's a bargaining stage is it's typically an if-then statement. If we did this, then the result would be different from what it is. Okay, her next stage is depression. Will we ever get over what is happening? How much longer is this going to last? Will they ever find a vaccine? Will I eventually contract COVID-19? And then once you go through these 4 stages, the next one for her is acceptance, where I can live with what is happening. So statements like, I can take the steps necessary to protect myself and my loved ones. I find something to be grateful for today. I know that I can handle whatever I am facing. Now, what's important to recognize here is acceptance is not the same as approval. You don't have to like what's happening. You just can begin to incorporate it into your daily life. And finally, the 6th stage that was just recently added is meaning. What can what is happening mean for me? So here it's a case of I can see how my life has changed positively beyond COVID-19. Now, here it may be a while before we actually see the meaning behind all of this. So this is what people go through on a personal level. Now let's talk briefly about what's happening with the global grieving. This is a denial where statement, it's just a hoax, okay? This was just something that was contrived in order for us to feel controlled in some way. Those are areas of denial. Anger. This is what is showing up with the protests, not only around this country, but around the globe in terms of people saying, I've had enough of being confined. I want to be released from this. The bargaining. This is often showing up as blaming. If certain groups had taken some type of action, then we wouldn't be going through what we are right now. The depression piece of it, we talked about the Great Depression that began in 1929 and lasted 10 years. The question here is, will this be an even greater depression, and how long will it last before life changes to where we can again move into acceptance? And finally, what's the meaning behind all of this? It might be years before we see this written in history books as exactly what this was all about for us as a global community. So I think it's important for you to just take a look at these 6 stages. And first of all, recognize that when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross put this together, people thought of this as a linear progression. Well, it's not. It's actually more like a loop where you'll be moving through the grieving. And then something new, some new information will come along that has an effect on you, and it takes you back to an earlier loop. For instance, maybe you hear that businesses can be reopening on a certain date. And that date comes and you're hopeful that, oh, finally, there'll be some semblance of what might be considered normal. And then there's a spike. And so all of a sudden things are shut down again. And so it might take you back to an earlier loop feeling like anger or bargaining. The other thing about this that people rarely talk about is it can be layered. So let's say that you've lost your job, and that was certainly something that many of you experienced when we did our poll. So you go through the stages associated with that. And let's say 2 months down the line, you see the impact of this on your income. So you might be moving forward with the loss of a job and be in an earlier stage with the loss of income. And you can see how this complicates things. So knowing this, let's go on to our next slide. Okay, how is this affecting our motivation? Because this is really what we're talking about. And it's important for you to recognize the relationship between the two. First of all, your energy levels. You're going to find that some days are better than others for you. There'll be mornings when you wake up and you're full of energy and pep and ready to go, and other days where you would like to pull the covers over your head and forget that there's even a world out there. Your focus. Remember, I talked about what it was like for me when I woke up that next morning and how difficult it was to regain a sense of focus. And this is a topic that I hear from many, many people, even recently, about what they're experiencing with this. Another one is mood swings. You're probably seeing people being more short-tempered, not only other people, but yourself. And they seem to be acting out of character with this. That's because they're going through the grieving stages. And it's important to recognize this and give people some space around it, including yourself. With productivity, you're going to find that you're going to have days when the quantity and quality of your work is higher than others. Accept that, okay? Experiencing joy. Let's face it, it is harder to see anything positive in what's happening these days, especially when we don't know how long it's going to last. Personal care. I've heard some people say that since March, when all of this went into place, they've hardly been out of their pajamas. They've just not been motivated to do the things that they would typically do if they were getting ready to go to work, like showering, putting on new clothes, simple things like getting a haircut. With all of the personal services businesses being closed, it's harder to find that. Impatience. This again shows up in terms of the irritability, having a low tolerance for what's going on around you. And think about what life was like before this. Let's say something as simple as going to the store. You would get in your car, you'd go to the store, and in a matter of a minute, you'd be out of the store and shopping. Now, you might have to wait an hour to actually get into the store. How does this affect motivation? You know, if I have to wait an hour, why bother? Maybe I'll just go tomorrow and just use whatever I have today to get through today. Finally, changes in sleep patterns. You may be wanting to sleep more. That is usually a sign of some level of depression. You may be having interrupted sleep. You may be having strange and vivid dreams right now. And do you know that you're actually burning energy as you're processing your emotions around this, which leads to fatigue? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these 8 areas, and we're going to break them up into groups of 4, just like we did before, because of some of the characteristics of GoToMeeting. And we'd like for you to mark which ones you've been experiencing that have been affecting your motivation. So Ron, let's open that up and see what we're looking at here. Okay, so first of all, look at your energy levels, focus, mood swings, and productivity. And go ahead and mark all the ones that apply to you. Okay, let's see what the results of that look like, Ron.
Okay.
Wow, look at productivity, 83%. Energy levels and focus, 78%. Okay, now let's look at the next 4. Experiencing joy, personal care, impatience, changes in sleep patterns. Okay, so let's see how this looks. Changes in sleep patterns, look at that, 76% of you indicated that. So that's right behind productivity. So it's important to just recognize that if you're experiencing any of this, it's most likely related to the fact that you're going through grieving of losses that we identified earlier. All right, so now let's move on to our next slide. And so these are the changes that you've experienced. Okay, and we've already answered that one. So we'll go on to the next. So now that we've looked at all of this, I want to begin to ask, what is it that what you can do about it? I think that the first thing that you need to do is to accept the areas of your life where you're feeling either powerless or powerful. So areas where you might be feeling powerless are, for instance, in the progression of COVID-19, when and if a vaccine is being developed, and how the economy might be affected. Areas where you might be experiencing power could be just in your choice to use social distancing or the PPEs, and staying connected to others. So you really want to focus on those areas where you do feel powerful in order to begin to regain that sense of control over your life. The other thing that you want to do is to recognize that, let's face it, how things look today are not the way they're going to be looking tomorrow. Think about what your life looked like in mid-March when all of this was put in place, and all of the changes that you've had to experience and adapt to as a result of this. That's going to continue to change. 2 months from now, you'll look back at this and say, wow, what we were going through then certainly is not the same as what we're going through now. And then finding new ways to enjoy life. People who are doing shelter in place, I'm hearing them playing board games and card games. People scheduling Zoom happy hours where they sit down in front of their computer and have a glass of wine and talk with friends. The only difference is they're not doing it in person. And maybe learning a new skill, like a new language. I have a friend of mine who's learning Italian during this time. So we're going to open up the question box at this time, and if you'll advance the screen, Ron.
So we have several comments being made, David, so I thought you would. This is from Jess. Our society generally doesn't seem to honor the grieving process. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that most of the time it's safer for us to just be up in our heads than in our feelings. So if you think about, the fact that it's not honoring it, it's about how would you? We're just not socialized to deal with feelings around loss. We certainly see that just in terms of when there's a death and how little time we're allowed to grieve the passing of that person. So again, we're ill-equipped as a society as a whole. Good point. It's something that needs to change.
And this is from Larry. I've heard that many sayings that the riots are even worse were sequestered with shelter in place and now taking out their frustrations. Any thought about that? Do you feel that there's a connection?
Absolutely. Not that there wouldn't be some of the activity that we've seen regarding the demonstrations with what's just happened over the last week, but I think also it's compounded. The fact that people are feeling like they are confined. And if you notice, when people are going out and demonstrating, a number of them are not wearing masks. They're obviously not doing social distancing. So it's just two incidents that couldn't have been worse timed in terms of their occurrence.
And again, this is from Larry, but a positive thing, doing more exercise with long walks and hikes. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, we're actually going to talk about that. So Ron, if you could go back one.
Oops. Okay. Let me see if I can. Is that the one? Or,
Let's see. So let's keep going down to the next one. Keep going. Okay, for some reason we had a change in slides. Okay, so let's just go back up one before we go to what motivates you in life. So along with this, there are 3 tips that I'm going to give you. And I'm sorry that they're not in the next slide. For some reason, they just decided to take a vacation today. So the first one is looking at control and power in your life. So look at those lists of where you have power. That becomes your focus. Let go of, you'll have to release what you're powerless over unless there's some way that you can come up with to derive power from that. So that again, you can regain a sense of control. Okay, and so then the other piece of this is taking your emotional temperature during the day. We talk about, the importance of knowing what your physical temperature is, but if you take a look at the stages of grief, anger, think of healthy ways to express this. And this is going back to what Larry just said in terms of exercise, writing, talking things over with a friend, whatever works in a healthy way for you. If you're feeling sadness, which could be part of depression, give yourself permission to cry. We don't have enough of that going on. These can be sad times, sad situations. If you're feeling depressed, look at some of the techniques that can provide you with a sense of joy. And then finally, with fear, ask yourself, what is it that I'm fearing now? What can I do about it? Do you know that right now, 70% of people in this country are fearful of losing their jobs? And the other thing that you want to do is to limit your news feed time. What's going on is I heard of one gentleman who had 6 news feeds at the bottom of his computer. And think about what that does to distract you from a sense of focus. If you're a person who likes to watch television before you go to sleep, I'm suggesting that you probably turn it off about an hour before you actually retire, because what's happening is your TV emits a blue light that will affect your melatonin levels, the chemical responsible for sleep. So these are some tips that I would suggest as we complete this first half of our webinar. Okay. All right, so now that we've discussed why your motivation is being affected, let's talk about what you can do about it. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so do you remember we looked at our gentleman with the carrot dangling in front of him? We refer to that as an extrinsic reward. And these are rewards outside of you that will stimulate you to move in a certain direction. So they can be money. They can be the goals that your business sets for you. They can be a trophy that you win. It can be a bonus. Remember when we were in school and gold stars for having an excellently scored paper, the grades that we received. These were all outside of ourselves that were used in order for us to move in a direction that was often decided upon by someone else. The other side of that is an intrinsic motivation. And this is more about the inner need we have for self-direction in our lives. The joy of learning something new, self-improvement, engaging in the world with dignity, cooperation, and curiosity. Now, what's important to recognize here is that one is not better than another. There's simply 2 ways we have of moving forward. And the best way to think about it is a continuum. Extrinsic on one side, intrinsic on the other. Most of us are somewhere in between. Okay, Ron.
a poll?
Okay, not yet.
Okay.
Okay, so Obviously, we want to take a look at what the upsides are to each of these. So if you're looking at extrinsic, what the motivators are outside of you, the upside of that is it gives you an opportunity to see how external forces shape your life. So some people talk about chance, fate. How many of you talk about luck, the luck that you have in your life? This is all about being extrinsically motivated. It can allow you to see how others are contributing to what your current state is. So you could say, well, this would be about what my boss does, what my company does, what my government does that gets me where I am today. If you're a people pleaser, what this can do is allow you to put your focus on others. And many people enjoy that. You know, we use the term all the time, people pleaser. That's part of extrinsic motivation. The other thing that it does is it gives you permission to indulge in certain behaviors that are used as a reward, and in this case, just for putting up with other people. So let's say you decide that you're going to be focused on a work task for an hour, 2 hours. At the end of that, you might be rewarding yourself with maybe 10 minutes on the computer, playing a computer game. If it's the end of a work day and you're a person who still is going to the workplace, it used to be that people would go out to a bar and celebrate with a few drinks. Or they might say, well, we're going to go off and play cards, do something like that. So again, these are the behaviors that you can use as a reward. Coping with failure, because you can pass the blame, the responsibility onto others. So none of us really enjoys experiencing failure, but in some cases, this helps to deflect it. And finally, it allows you to have vicarious enjoyment in the successes and failures of others, even if you aren't directly involved in it. Okay, now, Ron, we're ready for our poll, where I'm going to ask those of you who are in attendance to rate yourself as to how you see how extrinsically motivated you are. A 9 or a 10 would be the highest level of extrinsic motivation, 1 or 2 being the lowest. Again, be honest, no one's going to see who you are when you respond, it's anonymous. We just want to get a sense of where our audience is with these levels of motivation. Okay, Ron, let's see how we did. Interesting. Okay, middle of the road, about 44% at 5 to 6. And if you take a look, this is almost like what we call the bell curve, okay? If you're familiar with that, the highest incidence being at the highest point of that curve and the lowest being on either end. Very interesting. Okay, now we're going to talk about intrinsic motivation. So if you'll advance the slide. Okay, so what are the upsides of intrinsic motivation? Well, here you're able to take complete responsibility for yourself and what you do. You don't need to have other people acknowledge the work that you've done. You're able to give yourself a well-deserved pat on the back. It also allows the impetus for you to develop unique solutions. You're not having to depend on what others around you are doing, although there certainly is an advantage to groupthink and what you can come up with as a result of that. This again can be done in isolation. You're using your natural talents, okay? And there is an internal drive that flows from that. You're able to increase your areas of self-esteem, your ability to achieve goals, and your ability to self-advocate. It supports your need to belong without giving up your sense of identity. And finally, it feeds into your innate sense of learning, where there is this love of learning that we have for those with intrinsic motivation. It's learning for learning's sake. So let's open up our poll in terms of how you see yourselves with intrinsic motivation. Again, 9 to 10 being highest, 1 to 2 being lowest. Okay, let's find out how we did. Interestingly enough, this group is more intrinsically motivated. So we're not at a bell curve. We're definitely skewed in the direction of high levels of intrinsic motivation. Now, again, remember we talked about the fact that one is not better than another, it's simply different. One of the things that we need to know is that when it comes to these two types of motivation, we are typically socialized to be more extrinsically motivated. When you think about it, it's a way for those outside of us to exercise some level of control to get us to be what they decide is best. And we don't have ways in our schools that are really teaching how to be more intrinsically motivated, learning for the sake of learning, being able to look at the work that you've done and say, you know what, I was really proud of that. It really didn't matter what grade I received. It was what I learned as a result of this. So with the specific group that we're working with today, somehow you've managed to develop more of a sense of what intrinsic motivation would be. Other things that I've heard in researching this are when you're at higher levels of intrinsic motivation, you tend to be happier. This tends to be more ongoing. Extrinsic tends to be more short-term, intrinsic long-term. So it's just something to think about and looking at what it is that motivates you. Okay, Ron, let's move on. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's what I want each of you to do. I want you to close your eyes and think about a time when you were truly feeling motivated. Now, ask yourself, what was I doing? Where was I doing it? Who else was with me? How did I feel during the time that I was engaged in it? How did I feel after I completed it? And finally, when was the last time I felt truly motivated? Okay, this is a self-reflection for you. So Ron, we're going to ask you to advance the slide. Okay, so what we've just described, this is what we call in the flow. And this was developed by, and this has been a challenge for me, the pronunciation of his name, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he developed this back in 1975. When you're in the flow, according to him, you're completely engrossed and engaged in an activity. And it just feels like things are flowing effortlessly like a river. You're totally caught up in the moment and there's no sense of time. And you're able to stretch your current learning and skill levels. This could occur at work. It could occur during a recreational or leisure activity like exercise, sports, traveling, maybe spending time with someone that you care about, or volunteering. So let's go to the next slide. And now we're going to open up the question box and ask, what's an activity that puts you in the flow? Think about those characteristics. Just type them into the box.
Okay, we have, are you ready for them or what?
Ready. Okay, let's get started.
Portia has finding solutions when she finds something she solves that's satisfying.
Okay.
Jess is doing work he loves. This is from Portia learning, being in a spot of learning.
Okay.
Lynn is doing complicated cooking and baking.
Okay.
From Portia when she understands people, so communication.
Okay.
Jean is doing scrapbooking. That's a time of flow for her.
Okay.
Jess doing a favorite creative activity. I didn't see, Jeff is helping others. Craig, you had one and somehow it got by me. So shoot it in again. Michelle is badminton.
Okay.
Larry is working with numbers, data in a meaningful way. Craig, things that are intellectually challenging.
Okay, let's stop there for the sake of getting through our webinar today. These are great, great examples of being.
And one other one, sewing from Nancy.
So, okay, great. So as we look at these, we find that they're going to be different for each of you. And that's exactly what we want to look at. It's not that today's webinar is about showing you which activity will put you in the flow. It's identifying for you what it is that you engage in, where again, you're just caught up in the moment and time passes without even noticing, to where when you look at the clock afterwards, you say, 2 hours have gone by? No, it doesn't feel like that at all. That's when you know you're in the flow. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so as we looked at this, I want each of you to think about what you shared and look at each of these 4 descriptors. Is what you're doing when you're scrapbooking, when you're playing badminton, when you're sewing, when you're working with data and numbers that are meaningful, when you're finding solutions, is there a specific goal and plan of action that you have? Obviously, these are activities that you enjoy. There should be an element of challenge to it. And it should be an opportunity to stretch your current skill level. So I'm going to give you an example of a time when I'm in the flow. So I sing with Stanford University's symphonic chorus, and we have about 200 singers in the group, sometimes even more. And so our goal is to perform in a concert at the end of the quarter. And the activity that I enjoy the most are the weekly rehearsals. It's an opportunity to come together with people who are of like minds, and we create this incredible sound. The element of challenge is, for instance, learning a new language in which we're going to be singing. So I've sung in French, I've sung in Italian, I've sung in Chinese, I've sung in Hebrew and other languages that were not familiar to me. Also, there were times where we had to sing at breakneck speed depending on how the music was arranged. And finally, it was learning a piece, a very large piece in a short time. So we would only have 7, maybe 8 rehearsals before we were putting on a full performance with a symphony orchestra and soloists. And so you can see how this would stretch my current skill levels, just in terms of the languages, the ability to sing those languages at a speed where I was matching notes to the words without doing a solo when I wasn't supposed to. So as you look at each of the in the flow activities you identified, then you see how these elements come into play. So if you're doing complicated cooking, obviously there's a goal. It's an activity you enjoy. Because it's complicated, there'd be an element of challenge. And it's also stretching a skill level. So again, think of this and how it can apply in your life. Okay, let's go on to the next. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes again. And I want you to be thinking about the activity that you identified. And I want you to ask yourself, did it occur at a specific time of the day? Was it more likely to be in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, or didn't it matter? When I was doing it, was I more likely to be alone with others, or a combination of the two? Is this something that I would like to feel more often? And if so, what can I do to increase its frequency? And finally, how often are you feeling this way in the current work that you're doing? And again, you want to have a reference point to say that I want to be doing the kind of work where there are times where I'm in the flow. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So, how do you go about increasing your motivation? I mean, we're just talking about a task that you have in front of you. Take a look at that task. And first of all, ask yourself, is it necessary? Is this something I need to be doing? If it is necessary, ask yourself, why? If you think the task is boring, and let's face it, we all have aspects of the work that we do that are not exciting, that are not so motivating. If you do find it to be boring, what are some of the things that you can do to make it more interesting? You can look at asking yourself, is this the only way that I could do it? Or are there other ways that I could approach it? So again, this is an opportunity for reflection. And Ron, if you'll move to the next slide. So we're going to open the question box and ask you, what are ways that you make tasks more interesting?
So this is from Jean. She puts on music or listens to an audiobook.
Okay, great, Jean.
This is from Jess. He breaks up tasks into short time periods.
All right.
This is from Jeff. He likes to listen to music. And this is from Kathleen. She also is like Jeff, that she enjoys music, and she also segments her task into 25 minutes.
Great. Okay, now it's interesting. Go ahead.
And one more, this is from Larry. He looks for outside other examples, case studies. So they're starting to flood
Okay.
in now.
Yes, so it's interesting because when we think about this question, it is more of a challenge because we don't often think about how we can self-motivate. Remember, that's that internal, intrinsic motivation to make tasks more interesting. And because this group was higher on intrinsic than extrinsic, it's an opportunity for you to think outside the box, to bring in that creative side of you. And so as you're dealing with things, how to, again, make them something that you might enjoy doing more. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We're getting
Well,
toward the end of our webinar here.
You have a couple more comments. This is from Portia. She said she creates a carrot for herself, something material or an experience.
Okay.
And from Jess, he looks to intrinsic rewards of finishing. And Craig's likes to do things faster, a better way of doing things faster. And finally, from Portia, reward once I complete the task in addition to the task itself. And if possible, I wait until I have a lot of energy.
Great. Important to think about, especially at this time. All right, let's go on to the next one. Thank you for all of your input on that. Okay, so we talked about how you feel at the beginning of the day, how you move through your day. Now the day is over because we only have one day that we're dealing with, because remember, tomorrow may look totally different. So this is an inventory that you can take. Ask yourself, how am I better today than I was yesterday? If there were times where I felt stuck, is there someone who I admire that I could ask myself, how would they solve this situation? How would they deal with it? What am I doing to get feedback on how I'm doing? Certainly when we're in the workplace, there are opportunities for plenty of feedback, not so much now. So building in a feedback loop that keeps you moving forward. And then finally, what keeps you up at night? Is it worry? Is it stress? Something about dealing with the future. Remember, we talked about the fear. If it's realistic, I would say probably what you want to do is to keep a little notepad next to your bed on the nightstand and write down what it is that you could actually take action on. If it's something that you're powerless over, just do some type of a mental exercise where you release it so that you can get a good night's sleep. Because remember, you're already being affected with your sleep by the grieving process. You don't need to be adding more to that. Okay, let's go to our next slide.
I think you have a poll, don't you, David?
Well, I think we were, okay, so we lost our next slide, okay, that had to do with the tips behind this. Okay, so basically, I would say that what's most critical is that you be gentle with yourself. Again, these are difficult times. It's bad enough as it is in terms of the stress that you're under. If you're not doing it perfectly, give yourself permission to be human. And again, focus on where you do have power in your life. When you have opportunities, build flow into your day. Make sure that you're getting that sense of calmness that goes along with it. And as someone said, it can help you to be more motivated. Okay, so let's go to our last slide, I believe, which is a poll. There it is. Okay, so were our objectives met? Did you learn what factors affect motivation, the effects of lack of or decreased motivation, and learn to develop some tools around staying motivated? So go ahead and mark those for us. It's our little report card.
And David, we'll entertain a few more questions after this poll, will you not?
Sure, we could do that. Okay, so let's find out how we did. Okay, 38% said that they learned about factors, 15 the effects, and 46 the tools. So along these lines, what might have we missed in terms of achieving our goals? And that is something that we can certainly open the box up for. Your comments on that.
So at this point, we'll share some questions. Is that okay with you?
That's fine. Questions, comments?
Okay, this is from Jess. Wonder how intrinsically motivated people may use their characteristic behaviors in getting work, how that could be a tool for job seeking.
Sure, and I think in a case like this, you would be looking at, what exactly motivates you intrinsically and where the opportunities would be in the type of work that you're doing. So for a number of clients, they don't have to, for instance, being micromanaged, okay? That would be more of an extrinsic. For them, using that intrinsic, they can take initiative. They want to be working in positions that allow them to have more control over their lives and what they do. The less of a need for approval. They don't need those external incentives in order to get them to achieve their goals. They can do that internally. So it's vetting out any opportunities that you have and asking questions related to those, making sure that each of those areas is addressed, because certainly you're going to need money. Okay, so that is an extrinsic that is required. But again, if that's all that it is, accept it for that. If there are other aspects of it that you want to be looking at, ensure that they are a part of it in terms of the interview process and learning more about that company, that position.
So we have a couple more questions or comments. How do I deal, this is from Craig, how do I deal with the fact if I can do something, I take it for granted and get perturbed when I can't? So it's a frustration issue.
Okay, so you want to analyze it, okay? Getting frustrated with something that I can do and the problems that I might have around it. So where are the roadblocks? What is it? What are the obstacles that might be getting in the way? Sometimes it's just a matter of additional skill development. Sometimes it's our self-talk and what we need to do to build our self-confidence around the fact that we can accomplish certain things given more practice with it, maybe some input from others. Remember, we talked about the external performance and having someone that you trust giving you feedback on that. So you don't have to do this in isolation.
So this is a question and comment from Patricia, who feels she's re-entering the workplace, being a older worker. She needs to build up her level of self-confidence to compete in the current job market. Any comments on that?
Well, that self-confidence is really about what you bring to the workplace. What skills and experience are going to make a difference for that company? That's what companies hire. And if you can be clear in marketing yourself with those companies as to the difference that you do make, you're a more viable candidate for them to consider you. As far as age goes, we don't have to let that stand in the way. It can actually be an advantage for you because you have more of those experiences to draw upon in terms of your successes. I mean, think about what a 20-something brings into the job market versus what you bring in. And again, it's how you market that through your resume, through your interview process, through your networking.
Okay, here's a question from Stephen. Can you describe the meaning phase of grieving when dealing with the death of a loved one or close friend?
Yes, and that is so hard because during this COVID-19, my best friend from high school and college, I was his best man in his wedding. He died from COVID-19. The meaning, I think, is going to be highly personal, Stephen. I think that the meaning that I saw in it was he and I, in our high school days and college days, were on very similar paths in our lives. His life went in one direction based on the choices he made. Mine went in a very different direction based upon where I was in that fork in the road. And so, in a way, the meaning for me was the opportunity to see where my life might have gone if I had pursued more or made more of the choices that he did in life that did not serve him well. But see, again, that's going to be personal for me. And each of us has to look at meaning and in terms of how that fits who you are and what life looks like for you. I don't think that there's a formula for this.
So this is a comment and I guess a question. Your discussion of flow and why you related it. The person said she enjoyed the presentation, came in a little later, but why flow was so important in your presentation.
Okay, when you think about the definition, okay, that basically this is about energy, okay, that is involved in motivation. That's what flow is all about. It's an energy, it's a movement of energy. And so when we think about flow, it's that effortless activity that we become engaged in that I think is very, very important, that we don't spend enough time talking about what we do that creates that sense of movement, timelessness, the challenge that goes along with growing your skills and talents. So again, it's a way of directing energy.
Okay, so this might be alongside of this. This is Maricris has said, how can we help ourselves from not procrastinating? And you're talking about flow, so that's related, is it not? Not
Okay, you
procrastinating.
broke up. I'm sorry.
Not procrastinating.
Oh,
How to,
procrastinating? Okay.
yes.
So if I understand this correctly, if you really take a look at it, it's basically a form of fear. It's a reaction, a response to some type that you're experiencing. It's also, and it's important to identify what that is and work through it. The other thing that I've learned about procrastination personally is it can be based on lack of information. So sometimes when we don't know enough to take the actions necessary to complete a task, the fear would be if I present this to someone, they're going to make a judgment about me, as opposed to, I don't know how to do this. What are my resources so that I can continue with the task and be successful with it? So you want to, again, analyze what the fear is behind it and then work through that.
So here's a comment and a question from Jess. I've heard we have more energy when we get older by doing the things we love. What's your comment on that?
I wouldn't take issue with that one. As I am, moving through my 70s, I find that my energy levels are very high, even with this virus being present. There are so many things that I tackle. And one technique that I didn't talk about was, remember I talked about posting on Facebook. And so I didn't want to be a victim of what was going on. So I asked on my postings if someone would be willing to be an accountability partner. And within a few minutes, a friend of mine responded. So ever since the middle of March, every day we do a check-in with one another, that this is my plan for the day. These are the tasks that I hope to accomplish. And then the next day we report in on how we did with those and what our plan is for the rest of the day. And I will tell you, it energizes me. If I have any question about what I need to do, I just look at my list, and the things that I'm accomplishing now, I might not have accomplished if we weren't in this situation right now. I might not have been as motivated. Part of that, again, you could say, well, that's extrinsic. Remember, we're a combination of both.
Now, I'm not quite sure I understand this, but Stephen says, luckily I'm not experienced this yet, and maybe it's part of the thread I didn't quite see. If you want to explain this more, Stephen, be happy to have David comment on this. So we'll wait for his comment. Meanwhile, we'll take a couple more questions since we have you here.
Sure.
Okay. He was just saying I was not exactly experienced a loss of friend or a loved one. That's what he meant. I was saying that I have not, which is good. That's a good thing
Yes.
too. Any revelations? Here's a comment from Larry. How can we make strategic use of online forums and platforms? For example, use our breakout rooms and whiteboarding techniques can really be used effectively. Any comments about strategies?
Well, I think that you want to take a look at what those platforms are, what you're doing to utilize those, to develop them, and where those opportunities would be in terms of the work that you're doing. Certainly for me, being involved in this webinar was a way of stretching my skills, because most of the time I'm in front of a live audience. And so I'm learning what the advantages and disadvantages of presenting this way would be, how you can whiteboard. Certainly with the camera usage that we have now, you can set something up and do demonstrations that way. I mean, it's really about creativity right now. And we're really being challenged to think outside the box. Because right up until now, it's been all of these traditional approaches to how we work. Well, that's changed for us, and most likely it will stay changed. So how are you going to keep up with the times as they move forward? So think about or research what those next technological advances will look like and what you're doing to make sure that you're a part of that so that you don't get left in the dust.
David, I was going to ask you, they talk about Zoom fatigue, you know, just being overexposed, being on video. Any comments about that and how it plays into motivation?
Well, I think that you want to, again, time this. So it's about pacing. I'm now doing more webinars on Zoom than I have in the past, because we can't go and be in close proximity to one another. It's limiting them. So I might say to myself, just for my own mental health, I'm going to engage in no more than 2 webinars per week, because I need to have time to internalize the learning that took place from that. Because you can go into information overload, which is actually a non-healthy coping mechanism. It can be a way of distracting yourself, which actually can cause more harm than good.
Okay. And since you know a lot about job search, you know a lot about motivation and job search too. This is a long-term thing, finding a job in this current economy. Any little wins we could have each day? You talked about the flow and you talked about looking at rewards that we could build in for ourselves that will keep our momentum going throughout the week.
Okay, so I think part of that is looking at what your needs are right now. For a number of people, talked about job loss being first and foremost, both in our poll and what we learned about the 70% of Americans that are afraid of losing their jobs. So what do I need right now? Is it income that I need in order to survive? And then looking at what are my options for income? Certainly a job is one of them. Are there other options that you could be pursuing that would be important with all of this? Just looking at where jobs are headed, what types of jobs are likely to disappear or be severely reduced in number, and which ones will grow. So obviously for right now, if it's just a matter of finding work, I see jobs posted everywhere in the community now hiring. Now, are they the most glamorous jobs? No, but they can put food on the table, literally. And so you want to think about, what do I need? What can I do to meet those needs until things begin to, they're not going to go back to normal. I don't think we'll ever see what was normal again, but to where they're more stabilized. So in technology, obviously the work that we're doing right now can become the mainstay of how people communicate in the future. So if it's an area of interest for you, what can you do to develop the skills that would make you marketable doing this type of work? So a lot will change in technology, particularly.
How about the idea of volunteering right now? Is it a good time to volunteer? Do you recommend it as a way of keeping motivation up?
I think it's a good time to volunteer. Again, it's going to be a challenge because it's going to be less about showing up personally and doing work and more about what you can contribute in the volunteer world remotely, virtually. So, perhaps a nonprofit could use some help. If you're a person, let's say, who is good at teaching, could you be a volunteer tutor or mentor? Again, think about the skill sets that you want to develop and what might be some volunteer opportunities for you around those.
And Larry echoes what you just said. Volunteering right now, of course, is all online. So looking at things. For example, he volunteers at the San Mateo History Museum. It's still closed, but he's still volunteering. So there's lots of opportunities for research, connecting with people online. So we're winding down here. We'll take one or two last questions, and then I want to wrap it up. But I really appreciate your time and getting a very important topic. Getting the slides. You mentioned that you would be open to that, to giving the slides.
Yes.
Okay.
So just request that through Ron.
Okay, we'll take.
And there were a few slides. There were a few slides that were not available that we could probably insert, Ron, and make those available to anyone who wanted them.
Okay, just give me the slides and I'll insert them in whatever sequence you want. So we'll take one last question, and we'll wrap up. But in light of the last question, well, thank you, David, for this timely topic. And we have to daily think of motivation and have a plan, and you gave us some strategies. Thank you all for coming and participating today. And we do have a program on Thursday from Slingshot Connections, and next week we have a very busy week. And thank you all for participating. Again, have a good day.
Stay safe and stay healthy.
Okay, take care.